Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to go deep into Buddhist philosophy, and specifically this idea of two truth. You shared the Mirror of Insight with us, and I guess our mission is to kind of untangle this whole concept and see how it relates back to the Buddhist teachings.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic because the whole two truths doctrine has been a subject of debate, for centuries.
So let's dive in. The basic idea is that the Buddha taught on two levels: conventional truth and ultimate truth. Conventional truth is like our everyday experience. We talk about, ourselves, objects, emotions. It's kind of how we usually understand the world.
Right, and ultimate truth digs a bit deeper, goes beyond those surface-level appearances, and analyzes the components of reality, like breaking things down into their fundamental building blocks. For example, Buddhists talk about fabrications, which are those mental constructs arising from our conditioning, and also ignorance, which refers to our fundamental misunderstanding of the true nature of reality.
Okay, so it's like looking at a cake. On a conventional level, it's a delicious treat. But on an ultimate level, it's just a bunch of ingredients combined in a very specific way.
Exactly. Now, the Mirror of Insight makes a really interesting point. It argues that the later Buddhist tradition claims that ultimate truth is the real truth, while conventional truth is just a convenient way of speaking.
But that raises the question, did the Buddha himself actually teach this whole two truths framework?
And according to the Mirror of Insight, not really. The idea of two truths doesn't appear in the earliest Buddhist texts, like Pali Suttas. It seems to be a later interpretation, and actually it even contradicts some of the Buddha's statements about truth.
Wait, so they're saying the Buddha might not have even taught this concept that has kind of become such a cornerstone of Buddhist philosophy?
That's what the source suggests. For instance, the Buddha emphasized that true teaching should be internally consistent. But this two truths doctrine seems to present a contradiction. It says that beings both exist and don't exist simultaneously.
That does seem a bit paradoxical. The Buddha also stressed that he only taught things that were true, beneficial, and relevant.
Absolutely. The Mirror of Insight argues that if the two truths idea is correct, the Buddha sometimes taught things that he knew weren't ultimately true, almost like these noble lies, which doesn't really align with his character or his emphasis on honesty.
So why did this two truths concept gain so much traction later on?
The source suggests that it was an attempt to reconcile the Buddhist teaching on not-self with this idea that no self exists whatsoever. Essentially, they were trying to explain away teachings where the Buddha talked about the self by claiming that he was speaking conventionally, not ultimately.
So it's like they were saying he was simplifying things for his audience, but the Mirror of Insight challenges that interpretation.
Right. The Mirror of Insight argues that the Buddha never actually said there's no self at all. Instead, he emphasized how clinging to the idea of a self leads to suffering. He wasn't denying the existence of beings. He was highlighting how craving and attachment make us grasp at this false notion of being a separate, lasting self.
So it's more about the illusion of self and how that causes us to suffer, rather than some debate about whether a self ultimately exists or not.
Exactly. The Buddhist focus was on ending suffering, not getting bogged down in these theoretical debates. He taught in ways that helped people break free from the illusion of self and the clinging that fuels suffering.
That reminds me of that analogy in The Mirror of Insight, the one about the children building mud houses. They get so absorbed in creating and rebuilding their little houses because they're attached to them. But then the moment they lose interest, they just smash them all up.
It's a great analogy, isn't it? It highlights how our attachment to the idea of self keeps us building and rebuilding these mental constructs that ultimately lead to suffering.
It makes you wonder what would happen if we just let go of that attachment, like those kids abandoning their mud houses.
Well, that's the heart of the Buddha's message. Freedom comes from recognizing the impermanent nature of all things, including our sense of self. But as you pointed out earlier, the source doesn't stop there.
Right. It goes on to challenge the idea that the Buddha subtly hinted at the two truths framework in some suttas. It breaks down these passages and argues they don't actually support the concept.
Yeah, the source claims that reading the two truths idea into these passages is taking them out of context. We need to consider the overall message of the Buddha's teaching, which consistently emphasizes this practical path to liberation from suffering. And there's another important point that the Mirror of Insight raises: the potential dangers of getting too caught up in the ultimate truth idea.
Because if we conclude that ultimately there are no beings and no self, it becomes easier to justify harmful actions, right?
Exactly. After all, who's being harmed if no one truly exists? It's a very slippery slope that the Buddha would have cautioned against.
This is all making me think that maybe getting fixated on any fixed description of ultimate reality, even one that's labeled ultimate truth, can be a trap.
I think that's a very profound insight. The Mirror of Insight emphasizes that language and thought have limits when it comes to grasping reality in its entirety.
Which brings us to a fascinating point about the Buddha's teaching strategy.
Yes, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it seems less about presenting two conflicting truths and more about skillfully using language to guide people towards liberation.
So he was adapting his approach based on the listener and the situation, always aiming to steer them towards a deeper understanding and ultimately freedom from suffering.
Precisely. He wasn't interested in rigid doctrines. He was engaged in a very dynamic process of teaching and guiding, using different approaches to meet people where they were at.
Which is a pretty good lesson for us too, right? Don't just accept things at face value, even if they come from a respected source.
Absolutely. Question assumptions, dig deeper, and see how these ideas apply to your own life. That's how you truly make knowledge your own. So what does all of this mean for you, dear listener? Perhaps it's a reminder to approach Buddhist teachings, or any teachings really, with a critical and discerning mind. Don't just blindly accept things, even if they come from a respected source like the Buddha.
And here's a final thought to ponder before we move on. If clinging to any fixed idea of reality causes suffering, maybe true liberation comes from letting go of all our concepts and experiencing the world directly, just as it is. Something to think about, right? Before we move on, I'm kind of curious about something. If the Buddha wasn't focused on laying out some absolute truth about the self, how did he actually approach the topic?
That's a great question. It gets to the heart of the Buddha's skillful teaching. Instead of engaging in these metaphysical debates, he focused on the very practical problem of suffering and how clinging to the idea of a self perpetuates it. The Mirror of Insight points out that he used the word self in many of his teachings, but he never used it in a way that reified it as like a solid, independent entity.
So he was using the word self, but not in the way we typically understand it, like as this fixed, unchanging me that exists separately from everything else.
Precisely. It seems he was working with people's existing understanding, meeting them where they were at. He was acknowledging this conventional reality of how we experience and talk about ourselves, but without reinforcing that illusion of a permanent, unchanging self.
That makes a lot of sense. It ties back to what we were discussing earlier about how the Buddha adapted his teachings to the specific needs and understanding of his audience.
Exactly, and it highlights this dynamic nature of his teaching strategy. He wasn't presenting this one-size-fits-all doctrine. He was using language skillfully to guide people towards a deeper understanding. Sometimes he might have spoken in more conventional terms, using language that was easy to grasp. Other times he might have employed a more analytical approach, breaking down experience into its fundamental components to kind of encourage a different way of seeing.
So in a way, he was using both conventional and ultimate truth, but not as two separate and conflicting realities, more like two sides of the same coin. Two different ways of using language to point towards the same goal: liberation from suffering.
That's a great way to put it. And this challenges that notion that the Buddha was trying to convey some secret hidden truth that only like an elite few could understand. His teachings were always aimed at helping people understand the nature of suffering and the path to liberation, regardless of their level of understanding.
It reminds me of how the Mirror of Insight talks about Sister Vajira, whose verses are often cited as evidence for the two truths doctrine, but the source offers a different interpretation, right?
Yes, Sister Vajira's verses are really interesting because they seem to directly address this question of self and beings. One of her most famous lines is, "This is purely a pile of fabrications. Here no being can be pinned down." But the Mirror of Insight argues that she wasn't actually denying the existence of beings or a self. Instead, she was pointing to the impermanent constructed nature of these concepts.
So she wasn't saying beings don't exist. She was challenging our typical understanding of what a being is.
Right, just as saying, look, we use this word being, but let's not forget it's just a label, a mental construct, not some fixed independent entity.
And the Mirror of Insight connects this back to the Buddha's analogy of children building mud houses.
Exactly. Both the chariot analogy that's used by Sister Vajira and the Buddha's mud house metaphor highlight this process of clinging and craving. Putting something together, whether it's a chariot or a mud house, represents our tendency to grasp onto things, to try to make them solid and permanent. Taking it apart then symbolizes the liberation that comes from letting go of that attachment.
So the Buddha's saying, as long as you're caught up in building these elaborate structures, whether they're physical or mental, you're going to experience suffering. But if you can let go of that need to build and cling, you can find freedom.
That's the essence of it. And importantly, this doesn't mean we have to reject the world or deny the reality of our experiences. It's about recognizing that impermanent conditional nature of all things, including our sense of self.
This makes me think about how easy it is to get caught up in our own mental constructs, our own stories about who we are and how the world works. We start to believe these stories are reality, and then we suffer when they inevitably change or fall apart.
That's a really important point. The Buddhist teachings offer us a way to break free from that cycle of suffering, by cultivating mindfulness and understanding the true nature of reality. It's about seeing through the illusions we create and recognizing the fluidity and the interconnectedness of everything.
But I remember the Mirror of Insight also points out a few specific examples from the Pali Canon that are often used to support the two truths doctrine, but they don't actually hold up under closer scrutiny.
That's right. One example involves a conversation between the Buddha and a member of another philosophical school. The Buddha uses the school's own terminology to explain a concept, but then clarifies that he doesn't cling to those terms himself.
So he's meeting them on their own ground, using their language but making it clear that he's not endorsing their entire worldview.
Exactly. The source argues that this is a demonstration of skillful means, not an endorsement of two truths. He's using language strategically to guide his listener towards a deeper understanding.
It's like you're saying, let's use your words for now, but remember that ultimately these are just words pointers, not the reality itself.
Yes, and there's another example where the Buddha distinguishes between teachings that require further explanation and those that are self-evident. Commentators often interpret this as evidence for two truths, but the Mirror of Insight challenges that interpretation.
Instead, it's suggesting that this distinction is more about the context and purpose of the teaching. Sometimes a more elaborate explanation is needed, while other times a simple statement is sufficient.
Precisely. The point is that the Buddha was very flexible and adaptable in his approach, always aiming to convey the truth in the most effective way possible.
And the source also warns about the dangers of misinterpreting certain teachings, especially the teaching on not-self.
Right. It gives an example of a monk who hears that the five aggregates, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness are not self. He then concludes that there's no self at all, and therefore no consequences for his actions.
That's a pretty extreme interpretation. It seems like he's missing the point entirely.
Absolutely. The Buddha rebukes the monk for this line of thinking, emphasizing that the teaching on not-self is meant to lead to liberation, not to justify harmful actions.
So it's not about nihilism or denying the reality of our experience. It's about understanding the true nature of self, how it's impermanent, interconnected, and ultimately empty of inherent existence, and how clinging to a false sense of self leads to suffering.
That's the key takeaway. And the Mirror of Insight suggests that this misinterpretation stems from the same kind of thinking that led to the two truths doctrine, this idea that there's some ultimate absolute truth about the non-existence of the self, which can be really dangerous if taken to extremes.
This reinforces the importance of approaching these teachings with discernment, remembering that the ultimate goal is to alleviate suffering and cultivate wisdom and compassion.
Right, and the Mirror of Insight ultimately makes a very compelling case for moving beyond the two truths framework and embracing a more nuanced understanding of the Buddha's teaching strategy. It's about recognizing the skillful use of language and the importance of direct experience and personal investigation.
Which is a great reminder for all of us. Don't just take things at face value, question assumptions, dig deeper, and see how these ideas apply to your own life.
Exactly. That's how we can move beyond intellectual understanding to a more embodied, lived experience of the Buddha's teachings.
Okay, deep divers, we're going to take a quick pause here. When we come back, we'll wrap up our exploration of two truths and consider what it all means for our own understanding of reality and the path to liberation. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been having a fascinating conversation about the two truths doctrine in Buddhism. And, as we've seen, the Mirror Insight presents a pretty compelling argument for reevaluating how we understand this concept.
Yeah, what's really stood out to me is how the source challenges us to look beyond any fixed idea of reality, even those that are presented as ultimate truths. Like clinging to those concepts can actually hinder our progress on this path to liberation.
It's almost like getting stuck in a mental trap, isn't it? We think we found the answer to the ultimate truth, but maybe the real journey is about letting go of all those rigid ideas and just experiencing the world directly.
That's a great way to put it. And I think this brings us back to the Buddha's skillful use of language. He wasn't concerned with presenting this grand unified theory of everything. Instead, he was using words as tools to guide people toward this direct experience of reality, an experience that actually transcends language itself.
It's like those 𝙀𝙢𝙖𝙞𝙀, right? They're not puzzles to be solved intellectually. They're designed to kind of break down our conceptual frameworks and open us up to a more intuitive, experiential understanding.
That's a great analogy, and it reminds me of a passage from the Mirror of Insight where the Buddha says, having directly known the extent of designation and the extent of the objects of designation, the extent to which the cycle revolves, having directly known that the monk is released.
Wow, that's powerful. It's like he's saying once you see through those limitations of language and concepts, you're free.
Exactly. The key is to recognize that words are just pointers, not the reality itself. The Buddha was a master of using those pointers to guide his listeners toward a direct apprehension of truth.
So how do we apply this to our own lives? Should we just toss out all concepts and labels and just live in a constant state of unknowing?
Not necessarily. It's not about rejecting language and concepts completely. It's more about using them skillfully, being aware of their limitations, and not mistaking them for reality itself.
So it's okay to say, I'm happy, or that's a beautiful tree, but we shouldn't cling to those labels as if they represent some ultimate unchanging truth about ourselves or the world.
Right. The key is to cultivate mindfulness, to pay attention to our experience in the present moment without getting lost in our thoughts and interpretations. That's how we can begin to break free from that cycle of clinging and suffering.
This reminds me of how much time we spend in our heads analyzing and overthinking everything instead of just experiencing life as it unfolds.
That's the trap of the conceptual mind. The Buddha's teachings offer us a way out of that trap by emphasizing the importance of direct experience, mindfulness, and compassion.
So if we're not supposed to cling to this idea of two truths, what's the best way to approach the Buddha's teachings?
Well, I think the Mirror of Insight gives us some valuable guidance. It encourages us to engage with the teachings in a critical and discerning way, to question assumptions, explore different perspectives, and see how these ideas actually apply to our own lives.
Don't just accept things at face value, even if they come from a respected source. Think for yourself, investigate, and see what resonates with your own experience.
Precisely. And the source reminds us that the Buddha himself encouraged this kind of critical inquiry. He wasn't interested in blind faith or dogma. He wanted people to discover the truth for themselves.
So this deep dive has been about much more than just two truths. It's been an exploration of reality, the power of language, and ultimately the path to liberation.
It's been a journey into the heart of Buddhist philosophy and a reminder that the true path to understanding involves direct experience, mindfulness, and compassion.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration and that you'll continue to ponder these ideas and see how they apply to your own life.
Remember, the path to liberation is always open, and the Buddha's teachings offer a timeless guide for anyone seeking to break free from suffering and cultivate wisdom and compassion.